I'm Julia Flynn Seiler. I'm a visiting scholar and director of Genium Conversations at the Oxford Center for Life Writing. The Genium Conversations are made possible by the Genium Foundation, a family foundation established by Oxford graduate Andrew Clarkson to support conservation and to deepen our understanding of the natural world and the arts. This is the third and final conversation of our spring series, and we hope to bring the Genium Conversations back next spring. For those who are new to us, ACLU is a world-leading center for life writing, bringing together authors, scholars, and readers to explore, discuss, and write. We're so honored to have the founder of ACLU here, Dame Hermione Lee, and also our director, Kate Kennedy. And I just want to say a warm, incredible thanks to the staff of ACLU, who have labored long and hard and are just an ace team. So anyways, this year marks our 15th anniversary, and none of it, including this series, would have been possible without generous donors. If you'd like to be part of what comes next, whether by supporting events like this, funding writers to develop new works, or to help bring local life writing into classrooms, you can give to our anniversary appeal via the QR code on the term card or the card reader over here. And we're always glad to talk about other ways to get involved with ACLU. Now, tonight's event. Life writing takes many forms: memoir, biography, letters, diaries, and as our guest tonight has shown, the Nature Journal. When Amy Tan began sketching and writing about the birds visiting her California garden in 2017, she was not setting out to write a book. She was paying attention to the creatures outside her window and to her own interior life during a period of uncertainty and change. The result is an absolutely beautiful book, the Backyard Bird Chronicles. And it's what she has called spontaneous memoir, a record of what is seen in the moment that becomes on the page a portrait of a life. Now, to explore what birds mean to us as writers, as observers, as human beings, so honored that Amy is joined this evening by the Reverend Professor Andrew Gosler, who is a professor of ethno-ornithology at the University of Oxford and one of the world's leading experts on human-bird interactions. Professor Gosler's life work sits at the remarkable intersection of science, culture, and spirituality. I'll be moderating the conversation, and I know we're in for an evening of genuine wonder and surprise with these two very generous people to be here tonight. So thank you, both of you. Please welcome Amy Tan and Andrew Gosler. I'm so glad to be here with you. This is so much fun. So both of you are people who, in different ways, are obsessed with birds. Andy, you're a scientist who has spent decades studying them. Amy, you're a novelist, a writer, who picked up a sketchbook during the pandemic and before as well, and found you couldn't stop. You got obsessed. And what I hope we'll discover is that the two of you are not really coming from a different place, but instead you have a lot more overlap and shared interests than might first appear as a scientist and a creative person. So Amy, let's start with you, if I may. You've written 2 memoirs, 6 novels, and now the Backyard Bird Chronicles, which is something you describe as a record of my life. So what did the combination of journaling and sketching allow you to do as a form of life writing that your other work did not allow you to do?
Well, I would have to say that the big difference is when I began this journal, meaning I was a beginner. I was taken back to that place in my life where I knew nothing about the subject I was going to write about. It was purely about curiosity and what I would find. drawing had been a passion of mine since I was a child, but I was told that would lead to unemployment and, homelessness. So I never really tried that. It wasn't until I was 64, your age, that I was able to attempt that. Well, you're a little bit older than that. But I tried that. So what was different is that I was starting at a place of ignorance, naivete, and openness. And I will say, one of the wonderful things about the book is it allowed me to be the beginner, which is what I had to be to believe that I could simply do something for myself again. Being a public writer is very stifling. And here I would create a journal that I believe no one would read. It was a private journal, never meant to be published.
Amy, would you read a section from that just to give everyone a taste of maybe what you were doing and what you were thinking?
Okay. I'm going to try to read this actually from the teleprompter on my glasses. Ooh. You won't know what that's about until I just say, creating this journal has been different from writing a novel. A novel is torment. It needs structure, tending of language, constant shaping, refinement, exclusion, excision, cumulative insights that might give it breadth and breadth. I have to carry 1,000 pieces in increasingly complex configurations toward the luminous vision of a story that remains a mirage. I am driven to make each piece as perfect as I hope it can be while making this story that is composed of those pieces feel spontaneous, effortless, and without gyre and gimbal showing at the seams. Now, in contrast, the Backyard Bird Chronicles was pure fun. Spontaneous, a bit of mess, come what may. Perfection would have been the antithesis of spontaneity. There were no expectations. I could be openly naive, I could be self-critical, I could respect science and also allow playful anthropomorphism and a lot of wild guesses. Unlike fiction, I didn't need to hope the story pulled together. The story was the moment in front of me. One day, one page, one sketch. The same one that led me to become a fiction writer. By disposition, I am an observer, and I want to know why things happen. I need to feel the gut kick of strong emotions. I am drawn to see details, patterns, and aberrations that suggest a more interesting truth. I am obsessive and can spend months doing research that I may never use. But to me, it is time well spent. For the birds, I have never stopped researching the best bird feeders and the most nutritious foods that will satisfy all the birds. There is always something else the birds would like more. With both fiction and birds, I think about existence, the span of life, from conception to birth to survival to death to remembrance by others. I reflect on mortality, the strangeness of it, the inevitability. I do that daily, and not with dread, but with awareness that life contains ephemeral moments, which can be saved in words and images, there for pondering, for reviving the birds and my heart. With every novel I finish, I think it's a miracle because 3 or 4 other books never came to life. With every adult bird I see, the young songbirds, I'm aware that the young songbirds, 75% of them have died before the first year. When I try to find the right image in words that capture an emotion, I must beat down cliches and homilies, which are devoid of fresh thought and honest contemplation. When I see a bird that has died, I don't accept the sanguine saying, it's the circle of life. It is good to mourn and wish it weren't so. As my gratitude and love for my birds increases, so does fondness for these pages. The sketches and words are a record of my life. They contain what puzzled me, thrilled me, what made me laugh and also grieve. They are like the scar on my knee when I was a child in nature. It contains my disobedience and bravery, my curiosity and discoveries, my pain and refusal to cry. In these words and drawings are what changed me when I was naive and curious and wondered about a bird I saw for the first time.
Thank you so much. It's very touching, very beautiful. Andy, I'm going to turn to you for a moment because not only have you devoted your professional life to birds, but you have also devoted your more recent life to spirituality and meaning, and a lot of the same subjects that Amy brought up in her beautiful reading. Specifically, you've written that your search for scientific truth has been, from the beginning, a search for personal truth, a way to find yourself. Can you tell us about that journey a little and where birds led you that you didn't expect? And I have to say, by the way, Andy is an esteemed academic writer, but also a beautiful personal writer. And maybe most people don't realize that. So,
thank you. That's big coming from you. Thanks so much. Birds, probably from the age of 4. My earliest memory of birds was discovering a blackbird nest in the back garden. Very unusually nesting on the ground in a herbaceous border. They don't normally do that, which is probably why they failed. But when I discovered them, the chicks had hatched. And at the age of 4, it was very exciting to poke this nest and have the jack-in-the-box of these 4 chicks. So, ooh, and I probably prodded that nest to destruction because I know the next day they were all dead, and so that was life and death, and I probably caused it. But I like to think, 60-odd years on, that, well, maybe that contributed to leading me on a life's journey with birds. So maybe there's a little bit of payback.
a theme of surprise, too.
Yeah, surprise is so important, and you mentioned that, I think, right at the end of the book. And so, yeah, I mean, birds throughout my childhood, teens, I guess, and like you with with being told, oh, you could never do this professionally. You know, everyone told me, well, you know, there's no future in birds. You know, you can't possibly have a profession in that. But in my teens, I read a chapter by David Lack, who was the director of the Edward Gray Institute here in Oxford. We lived in Ealing in West London when I was a kid, and he talked about the Whiteham great-tit population study. He wrote this in 1966, so the project had only been going for 20 years then. But he said he knew that the Institute would always be able to employ a field assistant. And at the age of 15, I thought, I want that job. And curiously enough, after a degree in environmental biology and another one in plant taxonomy, I was actually offered that job. So I spent 30 years working with the great tits. Some of my colleagues say I work on great tits, or, you know, I didn't work on great tits. I like to think I worked with them, or I was tolerated by them. Yeah, definitely tolerated, and preferably ignored by them. But there were some deeply spiritual experiences working in the woods. And I would say to all the students working on that project and on anything related, if you are not working alone with the birds, well, think again. Because it is that time that allows for that magic between you, and they are not just points on a graph. They have lives.
So that leads me to my next question. I don't think maybe everybody understands what ethno-ornithology is. Could you give us a definition of what that means?
Okay. So ethno-ornithology, sort of academically, is where ornithology meets anthropology, meets linguistics, and probably meets a few other things like ethics. And it is the sort of formal study of the relationship between humans and birds. And I mention linguistics because one of the most profound ways in which we can document that relationship is through the names that we give to birds. So we know of about 7,000 languages around the world, most of them indigenous local languages. And, well, they all have names for their local birds. We have English names for all the birds of the world because of science and empire and, you know, what have you. But there are all the local languages, the local names as well. And those names tell you something about the human relationship with that bird. So I've been studying the 7,000 English folk names. So for about 150 British bird species, we know of 7,000 recorded folk names. You know, everyone knows one or two. You've probably heard of Jenny Wren. But do you know what a bum barrel is? Or a Polly dishwasher? Or Joanna of the Dunghill? You know, just to name just a few.
Andy, by that broad definition, is Amy engaging in a sense, in something that you call ethno-ornithology, by observing and documenting the birds in her backyard?
I think in so much as it's reflexive, and Amy documents her sense of the relationship with the birds, so it isn't attempting to be a scientific, you know, when you ask, well, why does that bird do that? A scientist would go to the literature and say, oh, nobody knows. So then I've got a methodology for trying to find out, which may or may not lead you in the right direction, incidentally. But part of that question is, why did I ask that question? And why did I ask that question in that way? And that's a human thing. And when you start to ask that sort of thing, then it becomes reflexive, and I think that is definitely ethno-ornithology.
I think, you know, our impulses begin at the same place. Definitely, I say this is not science in the way scientists do this. It doesn't have that rigor. And instead, it had the freedom for me to simply go anywhere in my backyard and to look at that. But the impulse is curiosity and wanting to know something about the why of any of that. Annie and I we've had these great talks together. We're going back and forth, getting so excited, talking about all the different ways that we wonder and pay attention and observe, and then some of the differences. But I think the excitement was so much the same about wanting to understand what birds do and what our relationship is to it. So, for example, in my doing a private journal, I could reflect on a human relationship called mine. And that relationship could bring up questions of mortality. As I said before when reading, I think about death every day. And now I'm confronted with looking at the life of a bird and its survival and realizing that every single day is a chance for this bird to survive, to live another day. And I think that when we look at it from that point of view, a personal point of view, and our desires for this bird creature to live, we can also look at it the other way of what is happening in our environment, what's happening to insects, to global warming, that are again, looking at the survival of these birds. I think I'm more on the individual level of looking at each of my birds in the yard as opposed to the whole population of a species. And that was what was so exciting to me. It was the individual bird in the yard. It's the individual bird that causes me to fall in love. I don't give the birds names because they are wild. They're not mine in the same way that a pet might be. Yeah. And for a long time, I didn't know the names. But I do think the names, in a culture are important to have. The names for an individual watching birds for the first time are not quite as important. No.
I am struck by your thinking of death every day and the fact that several years of this journal took place during the pandemic. How did those two experiences interact with each other? The fact we were living amidst the pandemic and a lot of death in our area and around the world, and you were closely observing and very quietly observing nature.
Well, I have to say that I've been thinking about death since I was a little girl. I think about it before I ever got into writing about birds or sketching. It is something I have thought about, and probably that came about as a result of my brother and my father dying when I was 15 years old, both having brain tumors. We share, in some ways, a religious affiliation when we look at birds. And mine came about differently. My father was a Baptist minister. And so spirituality figures into that, and when you think about spirituality, you're often thinking about death as a part of life. And so this question chimes for me in my writing having to do with anything to do with emotions. Hope and love and grief and loss is all part of that. Death is like a gauge for looking at the rest of life. So it's not with any kind of morbidity, that sense that I'm fearful at all. It's with that fascination that, the life is finite. And looking at birds makes that notion of limited time much more acute, because the birds may live only a couple of years or 7 years, or if they're certain kinds of birds for longer, parrots, for example. But it brought it home to me what this is about, especially during the pandemic when everybody thought by talking to somebody like you at this distance could kill me. And there we are thinking, everybody's thinking about, we had that commonality of thinking about mortality. The birds made it a place where I could think about it with freedom. And with safety at the same time, because I knew I wasn't going to have birds kill me, by disease. So it was very compatible with me as a writer, thinking about this. All my books contain this thought about life and death.
Andy, how about you? How do birds relate to your spirituality? Because you've had such an interesting path.
Yeah. I was just thinking of what birds meant to me as a child, because I was bullied at school to some extent, and birds were a refuge. Nature was the refuge. And so the sense, I should say, I was talking to some Roman Catholic friends the other night who described themselves as cradle Catholics, and I said, well, I'm a cradle bird watcher, because I'm not a cradle Christian. I'm a Jewish convert who is maybe my favorite line from a sermon of mine, but anyway, whether it is anyone else's, is after my bar mitzvah in 1971, I said, well, that's religion done with, now I'm going bird watching. Well, the next line of that is in the sermon is what 50 years later I know God was saying to me. There was, yes, Andy, that's religion. Now come and find me. And I would say I found God in the woods with the birds. And that sense, so now I'm in a collar. That sense of refuge in nature, which demands nothing of you, unlike human society that makes demands of all of us. Nature makes no demands of us. And it is the sense I get from Psalm 23. He leads me by still waters, makes me lie down. During the pandemic, so you asked about the pandemic, when we were actually allowed out on our own and could walk around Sidlings Copse, and I found myself on a little bridge over the stream in Sidlings, and I read Psalm 23 to myself. And for the first time, read that line differently. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He's telling me, this is where your heart is. This is where the spirit is. And I think so many, how do I put this? Some years ago, a student asked me, it was actually at a finalist party, he said, "You're quite religious, aren't you?" And I said, what do you mean by that? And she said, "Oh, well, you believe in God." And I said, "Oh, well, what do you mean by that?" And she sort of looked at me like the rabbit in the headlights, blinking. And I said, "Well, look, I don't know what your concept of God is. So if I say, yes, I believe in God, and if your concept of God is an old man on a cloud, then you'll think, oh, Dr. Gosler believes in an old man on a cloud, and we'll go away saying he's barking mad, shouldn't have academic position. So until I know your concept of God, I'm not going to sign up to that. And I don't think of myself as religious. I would certainly, that might sound daft to people seeing in a collar. But engaging with our spiritual sense is about being a whole human being, and that is about connecting to nature.
Of course. And Amy, that brings me to a question I have for you, which is that clearly this was a very spiritual experience to observe birds closely and do it privately in a way, as you said at the very beginning, you've never planned to publish this. It was your editor who urged you to do it, Daniel Halpern. And I was wondering if you might talk a little bit about the process of feeling more comfortable with imperfection, more comfortable with the beginner's mind, more comfortable with questions versus trying to, maybe the way you approach your fiction.
Well, first I have to say the impulse to do this came about because of despair. Things had changed dramatically in 2016 in the U.S. There was an election. There was increase in racism, especially toward Asians, that I had never experienced before. It was so ugly, and I was paralyzed. I couldn't write. Everything that I was writing seemed irrelevant, seemed trivial, and I had to do something to get my mindset in a place that had more clarity, but also the freedom to go somewhere else and away. And so, like Andy, I found that nature was my refuge. Nature was where I could be, no demands. I could simply be there, and that had been the place that I loved when I was a child. I loved to play in the creek. I loved spiders. I loved lizards, snakes, frogs, many of the little creatures down there. I didn't love birds because I didn't wear my glasses and I couldn't see them. And the only birds I could see were the big blackbirds that were the crows or the blackbirds that were in the movie The Birds that would kill me if I let them. So I found that I could just simply sit down in my house. Now you have to imagine the place where I was doing this, my dining room, which has a window in front of my window doors. They're about 8 feet by 12 feet. And out there is a patio that's about 12 feet by 14 feet. And on the side there are trees, oak trees, and on this side there are bushes. Well, that little window or rather large glass window, was like an aquarium window where I could see everything that was going on. And that was where I saw the birds coming. And for 12 hours a day at times, I could simply watch these birds and not know what was going to come. Nothing was planned, nothing was organized. It was simply what happened in the moment. And that's one of the great things you can have as a writer, is not to know the ending. That everything that is happening in front of you is like a drama. You are the keeper of that story. You are the interpreter. You are the person who determines who is the character in front of you and what the conflict or the crisis is and where this story will go. For me, each of these little, I guess I would call them anecdotes, these reports about what was happening in my yard, they were individual stories of what happened with these birds. And sometimes portions of the story would continue the next day when I saw the stories with the same characters happening. But it was without effort. And that's a wonderful thing about being the beginner. You know so little. There's nothing you can do about effort and skill. It's simply not there. It was all about learning. That excitement of learning again, I didn't have to think about perfection, which I suffer from, this perfection syndrome. No one was going to see this. I wanted to be at least smart about this in the ways that I should be about anything in life, and not engage in anthropomorphism, but I did, because no one's going to read this except for me. I could ask questions like, do birds experience something like love? And at first I told myself, you can't go to places like that and use these analogies to really understand birds. But in talking to some biologists, it turns out anthropomorphism isn't quite the dirty word it was in years past. That you could actually find things that were analogous and use it for a jumping off point. So you're not looking at love, but you're looking at qualities and traits of, say, love, and maybe seeing whether they are experienced, whether you can see evidence of that, and where the evidence might be in birds of a same kind of care, nurturing. We ask ourselves then, as human beings, what is love? So I get to ask this question again, not in terms of the birds then, but to myself, what is love? I think the biggest part of this for me was to ask myself questions like compassion. What is compassion? Why do I feel compassion for a dog or a cat or a bird, but not for the mealworm that I feed the birds? Yeah. Is my compassion hierarchical? These are the kinds of questions you normally don't ask yourself, and now you have the opportunity to ask yourself. You're in nature, and nature has an order and a structure and a social quality to it that is not ours. So I get to observe and ask those questions. I don't have to use scientific rigor or knowledge because I don't have it. So I can just use the questions. What's in this book then is what I call intentional curiosity, which is quite different from the curiosity that most of us have as adults. It is a curiosity we had when we were children, and we wanted to know everything. We wanted to know what blades of grass tasted like. And that is what I used in this attention, intentional curiosity, and observation.
I was so struck, Amy, I was just looking for it, the end of the book where you liken the love of these two birds, a male and a female bird. I think the male was picking mites off the female and likened it to your lovely husband, Lou. Would he do that for you? And I was looking for it for you to read, but I couldn't find it. Anyways, yes, love and intentionality. And you had an amazing friendship develop as a result of this book with Fiona. Would you tell us a little bit about Fiona? Surprise, and I don't know about you, Andy. I love that part.
I took classes once a month with somebody named John Muirlaw's Jack. And at one of these field trips, there was a young woman. She was 13. She just turned 13. And I saw her scribbling furiously in her book. And she was in the margins, she was scribbling. And I saw these question marks. And she was one of these children that would ask, I imagined, why is the sky blue? You know, when it was like, stay away from her, get away from her. You know, she's danger. And I found out later, you know, Jack's talking about what nature journaling is. And I realized she knew what nature journaling was. It was asking the questions. And after that, I would follow her when we went on field trips, and I'd look over at her, what she was writing. I was like a student cheating, you know, to see what the answer was. And I realized she was the epitome of what nature journaling was, that you have to ask the questions. The answers were not as important as the questions. The questions were your guide that would lead you deeper and deeper into the forest so that you would see more. And I take that also now as a lesson in life, that you have to ask. You can't think that you know everything, because that is limiting. And you stop right there. Once you assume things, what you make conclusion, it stops. And so the questions are what I had to ask in this journal. By the same token, it's what I have to do with my fiction. It's a reminder what I have to do when I'm writing a story. I can't know the end. If I do, the story loses its spontaneity, its freshness, and it dies. So I have to use the questions, my determination to know more about this character, to guide the story. And it's the little aberrations that often take you to the turns that lead to where the story goes.
I love that. Andy, you have written about birds and how they can lead us to something nourishing, something surprising that we couldn't find alone. You mentioned the honey guide as a type of spiritual companion. Could you tell us a little bit about that? And maybe show us your stole.
Yeah, so the honey guide features in a book chapter that I wrote in it for a book published, I think 3 years ago, called Coming to Faith Through Dawkins, because that is my story. But the whole book wasn't about me. I'd written about that in an earlier book called Real Scientists, Real Faith, published in 2010, and which invited me to explore how did this happen? How did I end up a baptized Christian, let alone now ordained? You know, from my background, and I realized that Richard Dawkins had played an extraordinary part in that. So I wrote about that, and Alistair McGrath and Dennis Alexander read that and thought, oh, that's cool. It's probably a one-off. And then they discovered at least a dozen other people who had been brought to faith in Christ by Richard Dawkins, and they thought, well, actually, we think this might make quite an interesting sort of collection. So I got to write about that, and in this book, and I started by talking about the honey guide.
What is a honey guide?
So honey guides are extraordinary birds. There's several species. They, unusually for any animal actually, they can digest beeswax. And they lead people in Africa, various places in Africa. Actually, it's now been discovered that different species of honey guide may actually be leading different groups of people to honey. And the honey hunters, so in South Africa, for example, East Africa, they're all using or working with the greater honey guide, which has particular calls when it wants to invite a human to come and find honey. And then the honey hunters also have particular calls that are known by the birds, and so there are these local cultures. Now, why would a honey guide want a human to go with it to find? The bird knows where the honey is. The bird knows where the bees are. Humans have fire and can subdue the bees and give the bird some honey. Can open it, and so there is this mutualism, this mutual dependency. I was going to say, what is love? One of the ways, because that's big in my sort of newfound sort of religion, spirituality. What is love? And where do you find it in nature? Well, it's mutual dependency, which is everywhere in ecology. Every fungi depend on trees, trees depend on fungi, the birds depend on the trees, the insects depend on the trees, and vice versa. So that mutual dependency is everywhere, and I think actually the birds, those species that pair for life, some of the longer lived species like parrots, which may be together for decades, there is that mutual dependency. That's one way of thinking about love. Obviously, it's more. But this thing with the honey guides, we know from paintings, cave paintings, and the like, that this goes back thousands and thousands and thousands of years. In fact, it may go back hundreds of thousands of years. And that was what I was writing about in my chapter, the possibility that this sort of relationship may have been involved in our own evolution, our own emergence as a species.
So beautiful and beautifully written. One last question for you, Amy, before we turn it to the audience, which is there a particular bird that has, in a sense, been kind of a honey guide for you, or who has played a role, kept leading you somewhere that surprised you, or leading you somewhere that opened up some insight, or anything along those lines?
It's hard for me to pick one bird. I mean, the fascination of looking at birds is cumulative. So I can't say that there was one. I can tell you, however, there were two birds that opened me up to more about my connection to them. One was the hummingbird, and that's the bird you see there, an Anna's hummingbird. At one point, I read that you could attract Anna's hummingbirds to you to sit on your hand and feed from your hand with this little feeder about this big, and I thought it was a big scam. And, some guy had trained a pet hummingbird or something, but it was only about $1 to get one of these, so I got it. And through a set of approximations, getting the hummingbird to come to the rail where the feeder was, or to the table, and closer, I was able fairly quickly within the day to get the hummingbird to come to my hand and feed from my hand. And there is something that changes you when you have a little bird, a tiny little bird this big, sitting on your hand this close. I'm looking at the bird and I'm saying, "You're so beautiful." Mm-hmm. And the hummingbird looked up at me, those big glossy black eyes, and then went back to feeding. When a bird goes back to what it was doing, and as if you have not disturbed it, that is love. You are absolutely in love with that bird. The other bird was the biggest bird in our yard, which was the great horned owl. And we had two of them come to the yard. And these are the only birds I gave names to. And that was only because we had to differentiate one from the other. So one was Mom and the other was Junior. And I knew that it was a male and a female because the males are smaller, but this particular male had a white hood. And that meant this was a very young bird. And it was the mother training the young bird how to survive, how to hunt, how to protect itself from other birds like the red-shouldered hawk that came to harass it. And so I would see this evidence that you would say, if you're looking at, qualities of love, the female, which is called mom, taking care of the younger one, protecting it, showing it how to take off to hunt, which, by the way, consists of moving progressively to an exterior branch, looking down there, then pooping and regurgitating a pellet, and then taking off. And it was first, the consistency of having these birds there every day, of having 2 magnificent great horned owls every day, made my day feel happy right from the beginning. Lou would say, Junior and Mom are there, and I'd go and look, and there Junior and Mom would be. Now these owls would be, usually if you see an owl, if you're lucky to see an owl, it's at a distance. I could look up from my dining room table, and there they would be. So both of those birds were kind of magic, a mystery, and also a privilege that they had come to the yard and they had stayed, and they would come to me. I could talk to the owls. They would blink, but they wouldn't fly away. Everybody says you have to be really quiet. So, we would be noisy. We would be, yelling at each other and about what was on the television with the news about Trump, and the birds would stay. So they were unbothered. They were faithful without really being faithful in the way that we think of, that we'd want to have in our lives with humans. But to me, the fact that they remained
comforting in a way.
Well, it was also thinking about continuity in life, and what we needed in life at that moment. What was happening out there with COVID, that comfort was there for me with those birds. That there was the feeling that I could have hope, that something would continue. I just want to say something about the being in nature. There was science, I found it. I went to be with nature because it was comforting to me. And I found out there's science that shows that when you're in nature, within 10 minutes, your hormonal levels change. Your cortisol goes down, your serotonin, your dopamine goes up.
Yeah.
And so you could be with birds and it changes how you feel. That's why we're so happy. Constantly.
It's physiological,
And
absolutely.
the other thing is drawing and paying attention can make you smarter. So there is actual research about that. As I was drawing, I found, I'm paying attention to more things. I'm being aware of more patterns. And I think part of intelligence involves that, being able to discern, see patterns, find, anomalies, paying attention to small details and knowing where they fit in a larger pattern. That is, I think, part of intelligence. So yes, this is something you should try. Birds, drawing, paying attention, being curious.
Yes, so inspiring. I mean, for anybody who's involved in a creative process, whether it's writing or something else, just a beautiful book. Thank you so much. And let's turn it to questions. Anybody got any?
Thank you, all three of you. What an absolutely glorious treat for us here at Ockley. Amy, I wanted to ask, I'm so interested in this newly found freedom in your process and be able to ask questions and embrace imperfection. And first, I wonder whether that was something about that moment, this feeling that there is nobody out there to receive what you're writing, and as well as assuming it wouldn't be published, so you give yourself permission. And I wonder how that experiment has changed your writing since. I remember you writing in the preface to Joy Luck Club that you would revise pages 20, 30, 40 times.
100 times.
100 times. I mean, that's extraordinary.
Yeah.
But this is the absolute antithesis. Has it changed you, or was this a one-off?
When I was starting to write fiction, what became the Joy Luck Club, I had that same feeling of discovery, of the thought that these were private pages, and that in fact everything that I write, it doesn't matter what, whether it's fiction, nonfiction, memoir, the bird journal, that all of it was a kind of diary of my life, because it records what I was thinking at the time. So in the beginning, when I was writing the fiction, I had that same feeling of elation, discovering who I was and what I was thinking about. I didn't know that book would be published. And when it was published, I felt such a loss of that privacy. I cried the day the book was published. You'd think it would be the happiest day of my life. But I had a feeling my life was going to change, and not necessarily for the better. And I had to write down page that what was important in my life, not just in writing, but overall what was important, so I wouldn't forget myself. There were things happening all around me, agents and editors and publicists, and I wrote down something I had read which had to do with beginner's mind, and it was, in the beginner's mind there are many possibilities, in the experts there are few. And that proves to be the case over and over and over again. And I have to remind myself to go back to that point, because I'm not going to discover anything new if I don't think that I'm the beginner. So when I started to keep the journal, I was elated because here was something I wasn't going to publish. I mean, if you had seen the drafts of this is scribbles on a page. This is sketches that were inaccurate. We were talking about, what you notice about birds and what I was learning to notice, and there's still a lot that I haven't noticed, like the toes or the feet of a bird, and what difference that makes. These little details that I could relish and feel was important for that day without any purpose other than that. My editor, however, needed to have my next book, and he said, "How's that novel coming?" That is the question every writer hates, how's the book doing? Never ask a writer what the next book is about. Great waves of anxiety pour over. So he said, "What about that bird journal?" And I said, "That's not a book, that's a mess." And he said, "Well, let me see, I can tell you, I can judge." And he looked at it, and I just look at scribbles, smears, copy stains, and he said, "It's authentic." Mm-hmm. And that was a revelation to me. That is what we struggle to get into our fiction after 100 revisions, to take it back to the place where it's authentic, where you're not self-conscious, where you're not appearing to be where you're not manipulating. Fiction is a contrivance. But so how do you get that point in your story where it now seems like it just poured out as a story and is not contrived? That is what I truly had doing the bird journal. And when it was published, I knew that I had lost something. I lost the privacy. I never will be able to draw and write again without that sense of privacy. It will be seen. And so I think I'm going to go write music now and never publish that. And then I would be able to create something that's meaningful again to me and just me.
Thank you. Thank you, all of you, for that beautiful conversation, which has definitely stimulated in my mind, I guess, an imagination around our relationships with nature. And so my question is, do you think, of all the things in nature, is there something very specific to birds, maybe their mobility, their ability to come to you, that means that there's a particular understanding of them, or there's an ease in understanding them better, rather than something like soil, for example, which is not animate but is still nature?
One of the things about birds, I think they are magical and they're mysterious and they are so beautiful. They don't need to serve a purpose other the fact that they exist, and they are so wonderful. But Annie and I had this conversation that I think is probably something that many of you have had. They allow us to transfer a lot of our wonder onto them. So one of the experiences, and there's a passage in here about that. I've had so many friends who've said that when a loved one has died, they will see a bird the next day, and that bird does something unusual, and they feel like that bird is the person who's come to them. I had one of my oldest friends died, and he was an atheist, so if he wouldn't want to come back as a bird and prove that there was something there. But I saw that day after, I saw a robin, which is a very typical bird. They're very common, but they never come into my yard. I saw a purple finch, which is not a rare bird, but it never came into my yard. And I saw a Sonoma chipmunk, which no one sees in this county and in their backyard. And these three animals within a half an hour, was so unusual. And it caused me to hear my friend Asa, the atheist, say, how many times do I have to get into animal drag before you believe it's me? And so Annie and I were talking about this, this nature. And I will say, well, when you have grief and love and loss and hope, that when it hits with coincidence, then you have a kind of magic that happens, whether you think that it is simply your imagination or you need to believe that or whatever, or is it truly that these birds are a messenger of some kind, that they do have a spiritual nature to them and they are able to connect with us. I've certainly found that birds are much smarter than I ever thought, that they can communicate things if only we pay attention, proven to me over and over and over again. But I think we should have the opinion of somebody who is actually in that world.
As the scientist in me says, well, birds are amazing because they're diurnal, they're noisy, they're kind of in your face, you can't miss them, but they can do so many things that we cannot do. Yeah, we've discovered how to fly, but only by studying birds' wings, and they do it effortlessly, and that is their number one mode of motility, whatever. They migrate. Their respiration system is way better than ours. Bar-headed geese fly across the Himalayas above 30,000 feet. You try that. You try standing on the top of Everest without oxygen, let alone migrating, and they do that every year. Unbelievable. The miner's canary, people were using canaries down coal mines because their respiration system. So there's a lot there that is surprising, but the surprise. I've got a wonderful book that I was given when I was baptized, actually, called God of Surprises, and it's in the surprises that you are, and it might be a surprise of coincidence that you think, oh, really? Okay, maybe there is something going on there. So I was asked about my stoles, so this does seem to be, so I have 4 of these. We have 4 in different liturgical colours, but this is the one that you're ordained in. And all of my stoles have Julia did say, "Are you going to wear this throughout?" And I said,
With his birder
I thought that
outfit,
might be a bit weird. Actually, people might wonder what they've come to. But so my stoles all have this swallow motif. Now, I don't know if you can see from there, but it's a swallow and two hands. And the story behind this, and Sally Prendergast, who made these for me, she sits down with you and she says, "Tell me your story." And so it was quite a long conversation. But the story of the swallow on this, so it was 2017 when I was an ordinand, and it was a residential weekend, so I trained part-time for ordination. And it was in the church, medieval church at Cuddesdon, where I was training, and we had a visiting tutor. Turned out to be a Franciscan novice, which was rather nice, because I'm a Franciscan as well. As we went into the church and settled down in the chancel, our own tutor, Grant Bayliss, said, "Oh, don't worry, but there's a bird flying around in here." Whoa. And it's June, and I'm thinking, a bird? What sort of a bird? You know, sort of, and how can I help it get out? And so this, you know, don't worry, there's a bird, is like, I can't concentrate on anything else now. So anyway, the tutors start talking about aspects of worship, and this swallow flies up. And I thought, swallow, of course, that makes sense. They're nesting in the porch. And it perches high on the east window. And I think, oh, well, too high. And I'm starting to think, what can I do? I can't put up a mist net in here in any way. I haven't got one. And then it dropped down onto the window ledge, and I thought, no, you're still too high, and I can't go sort of reaching up after that. And I started to hatch this plan that I've got my British Birds app on my phone, and maybe if I can play the song and set it to repeat, which is a possibility, I can go and set it down by the open door at the west end, and maybe it'll go up. So that was my plan. And just as a tutor said, in worship, leave room for surprise, this swallow shoots off down the west end. I thought, oh, that's it. So I jumped up and I said, excuse me, I think I might be able to help the swallow. And my fellow ordinands are saying, oh, yes, Andy's an ornithologist, maybe he can. So I go down there, and as I'm passing the low altar, I've got my app, and the swallow is fluttering up at a window on the south side at that point, and I touch the song button on this, and it's an alarm call. I know the swallow alarm call, because it's what they do when the hobbies are about. So I switch to the song. I go, set it to repeat, put it down on a pew, open the door, and I start to return, and I can't see the swallow. It's no longer fluttering up at the south side, and I walk all the way back to the chancel, and I said, did anyone see where the swallow went? Has it gone out? And they all point behind me to the altar. And I turned round, and this swallow had come over and was perched on the altar on the far side from me. So I thought, well, I can't reach across here. So I walked slowly round, and I picked the swallow up. Adult male, muscle score 0. How long have you been in here? I took it outside and I released it. And I returned to some applause, I have to say.
And Andy, I see the first chapter of your memoir. When you write your full life story. I think that's exactly where it might begin.
Yeah.
That would be a beautiful scene. We have time maybe for one more question, if there is one. There's one at the back. And then we'll have to wrap it up. But thank you for sharing that amazing story.
Hi, thanks for your talk. I imagine there's Amy Tan fans, like they read every book that you have, but maybe you lost some writing a book about nature when, like you say, the magic is attacked with politics, with ego, and like a specific like scientific way of knowing. And even I'm thinking about social systems, like when a black man was attacked while birding Christian Cooper in Central Park. How did you find the readership to be different than your other books? And also, how did you try to write to bring the reader into the magic even when they might not have had the space in their own reality?
I think one of the big differences for me in writing the bird book again was no expectations. And I had such expectations with everything else that I was writing, and the expectations sat on my shoulders. It was those that I had of myself and that others had for me. Every book that I would write would feel like a burden that I also filled with this sense that I had forgotten how to write. So when I was writing the bird journal, it wasn't really a book. It was a daily recording of questions and what I was observing. Unlike fiction, or unlike the novels that I write, I did have a purpose once it was published. So with my novels, for example, I'm not saying I hope you improve your relationship with your mother or you get to know about Chinese people at a more intimate level. But what I do feel, and this occurred after publication, is that I hope that you fall in love with birds, that you find a relationship with a bird, and that you'll want to save them. There is such a great danger to what's happening to birds in so many different ways. And I think that we need more people to care, because all of the solutions depend on a greater number of people to feel that way. So this, just to sum up, sometimes we have our purposes for writing, and they're very deeply personal, and only we can determine what that is. And then we simply have the need to write, the impulse to get something out. And if it affects people, it's wonderful. At the same time, I feel as though I can't take credit for it, because I was a very selfish person writing only for myself. And it is truly a privilege, a feeling of luck and grace that it reaches people, and that it gives me the ability to lead the life I lead today, which has a lot to do with birds and meeting people like Andy.
Well, and on this note, thank you both.
Thank
it's
you.
such an honor to have you here.
Thank
you
you
for your time.
Thank you.